Today you explore the pre-Columbian Americas, specifically the earliest immigrations onto the American continent, evidence, and theories. Then the Mesoamerican civilizations of the Olmec, Maya, and Aztec. And finally, we look at the scattered tribes of the North American continent. So here's the story. First, we want to take a moment with the Ice Age, which a small ice age took place between 25,000 BC and 11,000 BC, according to geologists. This created a bridge across the region that today is known as the Bering Strait, and it is over this strait that we think, one theory is, the first Americans migrated onto the American continent. We have evidence of the earliest Americans in an archaeological find in Clovis, New Mexico. The NM here stands for New Mexico, and they're known as the Clovis hunters after the city in New Mexico that the archaeological find was made. The find has evidence of flint stones used as spearheads and scraping tools. They also have some evidence of the Clovis hunters hunting mammoth, and they think they herded them over cliffs, or at least that was one method by which they could get their food. Here is a picture of the Bering Strait in the north. You guys can see it's Alaska here on the right and Siberia in Russia on the left, and they think that it iced over between the Chukotka Peninsula and the Seward Peninsula today. There are also evidence of these earliest peoples by stories that we hear from the ancient native tribes in the southeast of the United States. So here I've written SE, that's the southeast, and these stories tell of ancestors coming from the northwest. So this evidence is part of what historians use to piece together a picture of a migration over the Bering Strait, down through the Alaskan part, and down through the east side of the Rockies. So we think that the immigration went on the east side of the Rockies. We also have DNA evidence today, so modern science has allowed us to link the Native American tribes in the Americas broadly closely to the Asian people, obviously on the Asian continent. So we're certain that they are close relatives or closer relatives of the Asian continent than they are, for example, of either Africa or Europe. So DNA has told us that the Asians were the first to show up on the American continent, basically. Now something has thrown a wrench into the theory that they came over the Bering Strait and down the east side of the Rockies. And that is a find in the very southern part of the South American peninsula in Chile, in the Patagonia region, at a place in the excavation sites known as Monte Verde. And at Monte Verde, they have evidence of a civilization in about 12,000 BC. So if our Clovis hunters are our earliest at about 11,500 or, perhaps 12,000, either way, they were there at the same time, and that's the key to the significance of the Monte Verde find, that these people showed up about approximately at the same time we have evidence of civilizations in the North American continent. So that raised questions to, well, maybe there was another type of migration, another path of migration from the Asian continent. And so we get, for example, a young archaeologist, scientist who decided that he was going to use the technology of the time, a crude raft and tools, etc., and see if he could sail from the Indonesian archipelago all the way to the Americas. and that maybe he could, and then maybe there was some other method by which they migrated. So coastal migration was the first guess or theory placed, that perhaps there had been coastal migration along where you guys are, California coast and down along the coast in Mesoamerica and South America, and that would have been a much faster migration than by land. Right? And that's why there's coastal. But we have no evidence of that because the seas were much lower. It was an ice age, after all. And the seas were much lower, so if there is any evidence of civilizations along the coast, they probably would be submerged in the sea today. That's the guess. The second thing is to come all the way across the Pacific Ocean, and I challenge you to go to a map to see the difference between the size of the Pacific Ocean and the size of the Atlantic, for example. Easily double, maybe even more. The Pacific Ocean is huge, and so would present a huge barrier for crude technology. So the guy that challenged it and tried to test the crude technology built a raft boat called the Kon-Tiki, and like I said, he traveled from the Indonesian archipelago all the way to South America, and he was successful, so he made it across. And so we have that test of whether they could with crude technology. The difference, I think, would be, and it's a legitimate test, but I think the difference would be that Kon-Tiki and the scientists that sailed on the Kon-Tiki knew that there was land on the other side. It would be a whole different thing of a civilization who had no idea what was on the other side to try to make it across the Pacific Ocean. And then to even think that it could continue migration with more people across. All right, so that's all I'm going to talk about as far as the theories of the first people who moved onto the the American continent. There's lots of archaeological finds, and so we know lots about the tribal civilizations that showed up at this time, beyond just the Clovis hunters. But let's turn more specifically then to the Mesoamerican continent, because in the Mesoamerican continent, there were the most highly developed civilizations when the Europeans arrived there. So I want to look at a few of the civilizations in that region. And I subtitle this section City, State, and Empire because the political orientation or organization was somewhat more complex than tribal. And we think the Mayan had city-states and sustaining populations of 75,000 each that were in city-state, right, which means a political unit that is independent, it's a city, and it governs its surrounding countryside. And that's what a city-state is, and it signifies that independent political unit. And empires, and of course many of you probably know that the Aztecs had an empire when Cortez and the Spanish show up in the Mesoamerican region. So we'll look at the Spanish. We'll look at the Aztec Empire as well. But there's civilizations before, and the most significant of which was the Olmec in the Mesoamerican region. The earliest evidence that we have of the Olmec people is about 2000 BC. They are the first, as far as we know, to cultivate corn. Their corn that they cultivated doesn't look like your, approximately foot-long corn today. It looked more like a small 3-inch corn that you might find, for example, that pickled corn. And that was about how big it was. So obviously corn has gone through some genetic alteration as it's been cultivated. In addition to cultivating, they of course had, but they had irrigation and they farmed it. They planted with using irrigation. In their small towns or settlements, they had very organized city development with a central courtyard more often than not, and generally built on a grid, right, with the central courtyard and then streets radiating from it in sort of square fashion, right? They also built up mounds, and so we don't exactly know what was on these mounds, but there's lots of very convincing archaeological guesses. Archaeologists guess that these are either mounds that are used for one, elite residence, or two, religious worship. And a lot of the guess on that, with the Olmec anyways, is because we know a lot about the Maya and the Aztec, and in fact that's what they were building buildings on rises for. So it's a good guess that the Olmec too, right, elite residence and religious worship. We also know this civilization had a hierarchy partly because we have artisans who were both creating pottery, and they made massive sculptures. And probably the most well-known are and I'll show you in just a second, the colossal heads that they sculpted for their courtyard area. So given that there's an artisanal class, and there's a farmer class, and there's obviously a logical organization of the society, so somebody is organizing this. We figure they have rulers, artisans, and farmers. We also figure they have a priestly class because we have evidence of a sculpting of a plumed serpent head, which is very common between of the Mesoamerican region civilizations. They all share this sculpting of a plumed serpent head. And when we finally get to the Aztec, that plumed serpent head is named for the god, or is a representation of the god Quetzalcoatl. So that leaves us with the Olmec, a ruling class, a priest class, an artisanal class, and a farming class. And so they had a stratified civilization, which is a different and more complex organization than tribal civilization. Finally, they had a game, we think, that they played because we have evidence of a rubber ball. So we think that this rubber ball indicates that they were already had either leisure activities or a game that was played, and obviously players that were trained for these games. Right? And finally, when we get to the Mayan, we'll see that they, in fact, did play a ball game, and they had huge courts. But we already have the rubber ball with the Olmec civilization. And we know, too, that they were trading across the continent. So the Olmec lived on the east side of the Mesoamerican region, where Veracruz is today. We'll soon see a map, and I'll show you where that is. And they traded all the way to the Pacific side. And we have evidence of items that in Olmec finds that could not be made, or stones and seashells that were from the Pacific Ocean and the Pacific region. And that's how we know they're trading for goods. Here is a picture of a colossal head. This, as it indicates below it, is about 9 feet high, so you can see that just the size of the heads that sat on the courtyard. The big question about these heads is whether they represented rulers or gods, and nobody has satisfactorily answered that question. For art historians, they look at, you can see this head, it's got a helmet on the top, and then it's got fairly realistic representation of eyes, nose, and mouth. Probably somewhat formulaic, but if you look at the other colossal heads that we have, they're all different. So we know that they're representing either a specific god or a specific ruler of some sort. I think the most convincing, though, is kind of the ruler, because as we see, they have a plumed serpent that represents probably a god, because the other civilizations that are later and ones that we come in contact have the same thing. So they're probably, my guess here is, since it's a human representation, a good guess would probably be old rulers, ancestors of some sort, perhaps. And the fact that it's so realistic. I know that it looks sort of formulaic a little bit, but there are creases in the, for example, around the lips or even around the nose and in the central forehead that suggest the effort to get at a realistic representation of a human head. Anyways, I won't go into the art history of it all, and that's the colossal head of the Olmec. Very interesting civilization. Evidence of it from about 2000 BC, like we said, all the way to about 200 AD. Here, just so you can see that they're all different, is another colossal head, once again helmeted. Between the eyebrows, you can see that effort at realistic representation. The eyes are a lot different. They would have been inlaid. They know that on here with some sort of stone, perhaps. And then around the nose, the creases that have been put in. The nose is very different as well. Here's a picture of some Olmec pottery that artisans would have made. So you can see this artisanal class has, there has to be an artisanal class. Somebody with the time, I know this is geometric and not quite as sophisticated, but the colossal heads are definitely very sophisticated. All right, so that's the Olmec civilization. Mayan, very quickly, I know a lot of you know a little bit about Mayan. Again, we're in the Mesoamerican region, so that region that is today Mexico and Costa Rica, Guatemala, El Salvador, Belize. This is where we find the Mayan people. In fact, the Mayan people are located on specifically the Yucatan Peninsula. Right. This is probably the most famous, or one of the most famous, archaeological sites of the Mayan. They say that there's lots of them throughout the jungle on the lower Yucatan Peninsula. In particular, lots of cities that have not been excavated, and pyramids like this with at the top a room that is used for worship. So this is a temple that they appeared to have worship their gods, some sacrifice and some placating their gods with offerings of different sorts. So at the top of this pyramid is a temple. The Mayan are at their height from about 300 to 900 AD. And again, it's the Yucatan Peninsula. We have lots of, and I'll show you some pictures, excavations, the most well-known of which are here at Tikal, which is in the southern Yucatan Peninsula, southwestern, and then Chichen Itza, which is in the northern eastern part of the Yucatan Peninsula. And we'll look at both of those sites. But the Mayans obviously built temples. They also made roads. We have stadiums. Chichen Itza's stadium is probably the most well-known. They built colonnades. We have lots of sculpture to gods, and Quetzalcoatl, or at least the one that the Aztecs called Quetzalcoatl, is also one of those gods. They were polytheists. So I've just said gods, plural there. Poly means many, theo means God. So polytheists are people that believe in many gods. And the the Mayan are some of those people. They had a sophisticated, in addition to agriculture and many different techniques, because they were farming in the jungle to farm areas in the jungle. They had 3 calendars, and the first calendar was a 265-day lunar calendar, and then they had a 365-day solar calendar that both of them crossed over. And then finally they had a 52-year, what was called the long count calendar. So they had 3 separate calendars. On the long count calendar, they did things such as track Venus and astronomical changes in the sky, which Venus is probably one of those. So they're very closely followed, and you guys can see Venus at night quite often. It's usually the brightest star in the sky, and it's usually somewhere on the horizon. They also had a sophisticated writing system. They wrote with glyphs. So much like the Egyptians have hieroglyphics, so too did the Mayans have hieroglyphics, which means that they had pictures that sometimes stood for whole words, as you might guess, but sometimes stood for syllables or parts of words. And so they had developed a system by which they could create words out of glyphs, right? And that's different from a syllabic system, because the syllabic system will represent syllables, and then a phonic system will represent sounds, and that's what you guys have today, is a phonic system of writing. So these guys write in glyphs and write in hieroglyphs, and so we do have 4 codexes, which were books by the Mayan. All right, here's a Mayan temple, probably the most famous of which. You can see it's about 181 square on all sides by about 98 feet high. Let's just go back quickly so I can look at the Tikal one. The Tikal one is about 75 feet high. So you're talking about maybe an 8-story building or somewhere around that, right? 98 feet high, and then I note here, because there's steps on all 4 sides, it is oriented at the corners to a hard southwest northeast direction. So they have put it specifically on the north southeast orientation axis. They have 91 steps on all sides. If you add all of that together, that gets you to 364 steps. So that just takes them 1 day short of a year. So it may well have been something that they used for calculating a solar year. Beautiful temple, right? And you can see it looks like it's pretty much as it was. It looks on this side like they might have redone the side, and you can see on the left corner over there what it probably looks like with the ages. Same thing with the Egyptian temples. Right? At the top there is a temple, and again it was used for offerings and sacrifice, and the Mayans did engage in human sacrifice. In fact, that's one of the first evidences we have of human sacrifice is a Mayan mural that shows human sacrifice being conducted. Which brings me to the Aztec. They're not the only ones, I guess we would say, that had human sacrifice, but the Aztec Empire is interesting because there's 2 polar opposite things about the Aztec. I know that they took a lot from earlier civilizations. There's a big question how much they built and how much they just assumed on the civilization that came before them. But nonetheless, they had a highly developed central city called Tenochtitlan, and you can see it here, and I'll use my little pointer so you can see in the red area right in the center. That's the center part of the Mayan Empire. This map here gives you Aztec, not the center of the Aztec Empire. This picture here, this map here gives you Aztec rulers and the areas that they conquered. So Aztecs ruled from a central city called Tenochtitlan, and they conquered all the regions you can see with some exception. Tlaxcala is probably the most famous that stayed independent of the Aztec leadership. So there's your map. You can refer to it as you want. The Aztecs are in control, or enter the region about 1100. They think that the Aztec were only in control of the region for the last 100 years or so. And you can see on the map too, if you go to the legend with the Aztec rulers, that they 1427 to about 15, well, they take you all the way to 1519. So that is more or less about 100 years in which they built an empire. So that's the Aztec empire building. But like I said, there's 2 things about the Aztecs that are fascinating. Is city Tenochtitlan, I'll talk a little bit about that, and then their religious observances and human sacrifice. And partly because the Spanish come on it and they have their own tale, and we get lots of evidence about human sacrifice, both from Aztec hieroglyphs and from Spanish observers who showed up on the scene after Cortez conquers the Aztec Empire. Right? So those are the 2 things that are the most, a highly sophisticated city and a very brutal religious observance, and the practice of human sacrifice. In the central city and in other areas, we have excavation sites of bodies that had obviously been cut up by humans in a systematic way. So they're pretty sure they were sites where victims of human sacrifice had been discarded. All right, so Tenochtitlan is a city that sits on a lake, and it's a fascinating city because it had things like floating gardens where they could cultivate things on top of the lake top itself. It was linked to the mainland by 3 different bridges or causeways. There was a dike on one side of it to keep the flow of the lake from interrupting or disrupting the city itself. So they had built a sophisticated system to travel in and out of the city, protect the city. They also had a massive marketplace. When Cortez gets there, one of his men, Cortez himself, estimated it as about 60,000 people could fit into the marketplace. So I don't know if that's exactly right or not, but that was his guess. So a massive marketplace that was well attended, and they had the ability of these farmers who farmed all around Lake Texcoco to get in canoes and cross the lake and go into this marketplace. The city itself, like many of the other cities in the region for hundreds of years before the Aztecs were there, it's built on a grid. It was divided into political governing units that were political governing units. So there would be a governor over each part of the city, and then Montezuma, who was, when the Spanish show up, Montezuma, who was the emperor, and the emperor, of course, was central to it all. The population, when the Spanish show up, is hard to estimate, but I give you the low estimate. Some of them have said upwards to 300,000, so anywhere from 200 to 300,000. I think the key is that at least for the Europeans, they had no cities. They had few cities of that size. I mean, there were some few cities, Constantinople, that got up to that size. Cordoba at some point was up close to 200,000, but that was an extraordinary city in the European and the Mediterranean, North African region at this time. So when Cortez gets there, he's astounded because this Iberian Peninsula, or Spain, where he comes from, the large cities are at 30, 40, 50, 60,000, right? And so he shows up and, boy, this city's thriving, right? So large population. Like I said, we don't know to the extent that the Aztecs themselves built the pyramids, but the city itself has pyramids. It's logically oriented in a grid situation. It's got these bridges or causeways that link it to the mainland. And then, like the other people in the region, the fields are cultivated and a irrigation system has been set up in the region all around the lake, so they had irrigated fields. Now, Tenochtitlan sat where Mexico City does today. The lake, of course, at Texcoco has disappeared, and the whole region, though, is a very wealthy valley that has high mountains above it, and in fact it has a volcanic mountain above it. But it's got very wealthy farmland, much like you have here in the Central Valley. So not too different. If you went to Mexico City and you went outside, you'd see very similar farmland. Not that it's cultivated in the same way that we have here, but the wealth of the soil itself is very similar to the valley region here. The religion, like we said, right, provides sort of a contrast, I think, especially since we're sort of fascinated with the whole presence of human sacrifice. When Cortez shows up, they are in a period religiously that's known as the world of the fifth sun. So they thought that they thought they had to satisfy their war god, their sun god Huitzilopochtli, with human blood on a daily basis. So that's why there was human sacrifice, and they thought the world would end if they didn't satisfy Huitzilopochtli. So they did practice human sacrifice, and they seem to have had some religious celebrations where they did mass human sacrifice. The Spanish weren't there, but in 1483, we know Columbus, of course, shows up in 1492. But in 1483, the stories that the natives told the Spanish were that there was a 4-day celebration. And the Spanish got a figure of some 78,000 people were killed in those 4 days. I don't really know whether they could have done that or not. But there was some controversy in the literature over whether that happened. There is some controversy in the literature whether that actually happened or not. So you guys can have a look at that yourself. The excavations of the central temple, I think it's Temple Mayor in Mexico City, uncovered hieroglyphs because they had even writing from the Mayan in the region. There was this ability to write, and it shows estimates of that festival of 4 days of over 80,000. I think somewhere around 82 or 83,000 people. Hard to know whether they could have done it or not. You guys can look at the evidence in the argument yourself. I've heard modern historians or scientists who have made claims that only 2,000 would have been killed in that 4-day festival. So I'll leave that up to you. The Spanish and the Aztecs all say that there was a period of 4-day human sacrifice where somewhere around 80,000 people were killed. That makes 20,000 on any given day. And there's big discussion about not that whether they had human sacrifice or not, but the amounts of people. And you can see in the upper right-hand corner here, a Aztec, and although this was drawn about, I think, 40 or 50 years later, but by a native, of what it was like at a ceremonial human sacrifice. And you can see the priest with the knife and cutting open the abdomen, and then you can see a line of blood that goes up towards the left-hand side of this, and that's a human heart that's pulled out. The idea was that it had to be bleeding. All right, so that's the Aztecs. They are a warrior civilization, so there is a long discussion to be had about how it is Cortez met Montezuma and his warriors. So these warriors went out, obviously they conquered an empire, and they fought on the battlefield partly to get victims for their sacrifices. So they didn't want to kill people on the battlefield, because after all, Huitzilopochtli demanded a beating heart, a living heart, to be offered up to him. So these warriors went out on the battlefield with the purpose of bringing home live sacrificial victims. And they fought with club and obsidian-headed spears. And obsidian is a very sharp rock. It can be made very sharp. So those spears would have been very sharp, and they would have used clubs on the battlefield. And just remember, and we'll get to it later, the Spanish show up with a Toledo sword, steel. They have already gunpowder. The gunpowder comes into Europe in the 12th and 13th century. So they've been developing weapons with gunpowder, and they will have cannons and muskets with them. The Toledo sword, and they'll be armored. Their horses will be armored, and the Spanish conquistador is armored, of course. So that's what they're going to meet, and those are the warriors that Montezuma has at his beckoning. All right, so that's the Aztec, that's Mesoamerica. Again, Olmec, Mayan, and Aztec, and quite sophisticated civilization that can be put into contrast with the North American continent.